welcome everybody to this last but not least roundtable about planet and peace. In this roundtable, we are going to shift and turn the paradigm, the conceptual paradigm, because we are going to talk about the rights of nature and the key role of indigenous people. Okay, we think that we as people from the Western countries, we should learn a lot from these experiences from the other side of the world. And we should also focus on a shift in the relationship among humans and nature. So basically, we are going to talk about leaving fossil fuel on the grounds, but we are going to talk on such issues from the perspective of the rights of nature and from the perspective of the indigenous people. Fossil fuel extraction is not only the main drive of climate injustice, but it generates higher social and environmental impacts by transforming our planet into a zone of sacrifice and environmental injustice. And I think that in this term, the lessons that we have learned from Ecuador and from Yasuni are paramount, are very important. Indigenous communities are in the front lines of climate and environmental justice by allowing us to understand the importance of indigenous land for the future of all humanity and the unique contribution of indigenous people in centuries of resistance and permanent mobilization for life. So how in the phase out of fossil fuel can we recognize the priorities of ecosystem diversity and indigenous lands? I would start from these questions, and I would also just briefly introduce Pedro Bermejo from Yasunidos. Perhaps not all the people know Yasuni and Yasunidos, this new word. They start during the failure of the Yasuni ITT initiative from Ecuador that was about leaving fossil fuel on the ground in the block ITT. And they start this amazing process of connecting people, assuming the indigenous philosophy, the indigenous way of life, the indigenous perspective as the main key to interpret and to understand the world and to move people towards another possible world. So we have with us Pedro Bermejo, but we have also Antonio Tricarico, Program Director of the NGOs, Recommon. And I don't know if, because we have some problem with the interconnection from our colleagues, I don't know if Ilan Zugman is with us. Perhaps he's going to get a better connection. So I would invite Pedro to just make the connection and to help us from the Western country to understand what is the indigenous perspective about the relationship about human and nature, the right of nature, and this concept of leaving fossil fuel on the ground from the perspective from Latin American and from Ecuador. So the floor is yours, Pedro, and please take the word.
Thanks, Eugenio. I would rather to speak in Spanish. I understand that we have translation, so I hope this is not a problem. Bueno, primero quisiera establecer una serie de consideraciones importantes para poder entender la problemática, ¿no? Yo creo que, como tú has dicho, Eugenio, los pueblos indígenas han tenido históricamente un rol fundamental cuando hablamos en términos de conservación o de justicia climática, ¿no? Para tener como algunos datos, me parece importante decir que, por ejemplo, los pueblos indígenas, a pesar de tener solamente el 10% de la propiedad, conservan de todo el mundo el 80% de la biodiversidad, ¿no? Por otro lado, también conservan el 80% de los bosques. De igual manera, los pueblos indígenas, tanto, digamos, es tan importante cómo protegen a la naturaleza en sus territorios, que incluso sus territorios, los territorios indígenas, tienen la mitad de deforestación que las áreas protegidas reconocidas por los estados. Es decir, que mucho más se deforesta un área protegida, reconocida por un Estado, que el mismo territorio indígena. Estos son algunos elementos para entender que los pueblos indígenas tienen un rol fundamental en el cuidado de la naturaleza, y eso me parece súper importante en el contexto ecuatoriano, en donde existe, justamente han habido una serie de acciones, de levantamientos, ha habido un paro nacional, en donde hay una cierta forma, digamos, hay un racismo estructural que termina también acusando a los pueblos indígenas de causar el cambio climático por ejemplo, oponerse a que se quiten los subsidios a los combustibles fósiles. Pero antes de entrar en eso, también quisiera decir que un problema, una cosa que tampoco se habla, es que un día hablando sobre más específicamente el Yasuní y los pueblos aislados, es que los pueblos aislados, por ejemplo, del Parque Nacional Yasuní, conocidos como Tagaeri y Taromenane, no solamente son guardianes de la naturaleza o protectores de este lugar tan importante, sino que son incluso, Laura Rival, por ejemplo, los llama sus jardineros, ¿no? Los jardineros de la naturaleza, porque cumplen un rol que promueve la biodiversidad. Es decir, no solamente protegen la diversidad que ya existe, sino que también la promueven. Prolifera la biodiversidad gracias a esa ecodependencia que existe de los pueblos indígenas aislados en el Yasuní. Por eso es uno de los lugares más biodiversos del planeta. No solamente es porque en el Pleistoceno fue uno de los pocos lugares que no se congeló en el mundo, sino también porque los pueblos indígenas han cumplido un rol fundamental. Entonces, eso me parece súper importante tenerlo claro, ¿no? Que existe un rol muy importante por parte de los pueblos indígenas. Luego también me parece importante señalar en este espacio que hay una relación histórica de la división internacional del trabajo, ¿no? Como los países del norte son los que desde la misma colonia han sido los beneficiados de que esa colonización a través del saqueo, del despojo, no ha terminado, ¿no? Podemos ver cómo el saqueo continúa en estos lugares, en la Amazonía, pero también en muchos otros lugares en Latinoamérica, y cómo se mantiene esta división internacional del trabajo en la que los países del norte se benefician y los países del sur siguen siendo los despojados, siguen siendo los explotados a través de la minería, del petróleo, de la misma deforestación, la explotación maderera, la pesca, ¿no es cierto?, la ganadería, etcétera. Son diferentes formas de extractivismos que incluso, como digo, siguen pasando, ¿no? Pues me parece importante señalar como estos dos aspectos fundamentales para entender un poco la situación sobre lo que está sucediendo en el mundo y lo que representa en ese contexto el Yasuní, que, como decía, es este lugar biodiverso del planeta, más biodiverso del planeta, y que además donde es territorio de pueblos indígenas aislados, y que, sin embargo, a pesar de que nuestra Constitución prohíbe la explotación petrolera en los territorios de pueblos indígenas aislados, a pesar de que tienen medidas cautelares, hay un proceso sumamente agresivo de extraer petróleo de estos lugares, tanto en los gobiernos progresistas de izquierda que hemos tenido, como el gobierno de Rafael Correa, tanto como el gobierno neoliberal de Lazo, ¿no? Vemos que cuando hablamos de una política extractiva, los tres gobiernos son neoliberales, los tres gobiernos son capitalistas, y los tres gobiernos, sea el de Lazo, el de Correa o el de Lenín Moreno, han tenido exactamente la misma política.
Yeah, muchas gracias. Thanks so much, Pedro, for your intervention. I tried to summarize what you said, especially you were mentioning that indigenous people are the owners of almost 80% of tropical and non-tropical forests, but they are also the most affected by the impact of the Western development. And of course, they have a crucial role in conservation of forest ecosystems. You were mentioning the non-contacted indigenous people called the Tagaeri Taromenani from Yasuní, and you were saying that, of course, they are uncontacted. And the reason why the Yasuni is one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet is not only related to the paleogeographic dynamics of the Pleistocene, but also because of the role that have indigenous people in maintaining and taking care of the forest. Thanks a lot, Pedro, for your contribution, your suggestion. I would invite Antonio Tricarico, and I would also say that I would thank Antonio Tricarico and all the staff of Recommon for the job and the work to make important campaign about phasing out fossil fuels. And I would mention, for instance, the six-legged state campaign. The six-legged icon is well known, I would say, in different corners of the world. So the six-legged state is basically the Italian energy company Eni Agip. It's known in Ecuador, as well as Bolivia, in Nigeria, in Italy as well. So I would also thanks Antonio Tricarico and Recommon for this campaign, very important. So Antonio, I give the floor to you if you want to try to link the main topics of this roundtable with your activity, as like Recommon, and what you do in Italy in relation to campaign to phase out fossil fuels.
Thank you, Salvatore. Thank you very much for the possibility of intervening, and I'm very pleased to intervene after Pedro, which represents a very interesting trajectory of the movements in Ecuador. It has been said with Yes Unidos. Maybe the first point to address actually the main issue of the panel. I mean, if we think of the impacts of the oil and extractivism more generally on the oil industry and extractivism on indigenous people, I think there are three levels which are, in my view, pretty objective and clear for why indigenous people have been those probably globally suffering more the oil and gas industry and mining more in general. The first is that, of course, with the rush to get new resources, basically the frontier line of oil and gas has been moving more and more in remote areas. And that's exactly where indigenous people have been either pushed back or where they live. So when we tackle the issue about stopping the expansion of fossil fuels, and in particular oil and gas, this is inevitably and intrinsically linked, in particular if we talk about onshore operation, to basically the survival and struggles of indigenous people. So this is a very direct link, but there is a new threat, which is much more subtle, which is already heavily impacting indigenous people. Because in the wider decarbonization framework, you have the contested element of offsetting emission, something which has been only partially defined under the Climate Change Convention, but already trigger a pretty controversial experience with different mechanisms, in particularly the so-called RED project. So the projects through the reduction of emission, through basically reducing deforestation and populated by indigenous people. And we got to the controversy that indigenous people have been attacked as those responsible for not preserving those forests, where actually was exactly the opposite, you know, through their customary habits and their ancestry approach, they were able actually to live with a certain balance with nature within those forests. And today, in order to allow supposed to be preservation of forests are seen to be cut or destroyed, they're kicked out from forests. And in order to generate these carbon credits for corporations, in order for them to extract more oil and gas or burn more oil and gas and coal somewhere else. Again, this is a new form of extractivism, primarily impacting indigenous people. A third level is when we talk about the new forms of extractivism. I mean, we cannot deny that the whole framework is also evolving in the risk, despite a broader discussion about green economy or Green Deal, or basically triggering as I said, new forms of extractivism, including through green technologies. And this is an issue related already with significant fights against large-scale renewables, which are imposed primarily by northern corporations in several years in the global areas in the global south. But this is also related to the fundamental question about more mining needed in order to source the specific minerals which are needed to make function the green economy, and including the broader framework of the Green Deal in the EU. This is a debate which already emerged in the EU. Again, we're talking about areas where this mining is promoted, which are primarily populated by indigenous people. So the new threats are primarily targeting these people. Now, the issue is that internationally, we had elements which not simply recognize the customary rights of indigenous people on their lands, but they also gave basic significant rights far beyond, generally speaking, locally affected community in order to be mandatory consulted, having basically veto power, which is the free, prior informed consent. Again, this has been systematically attacked, particularly by corporate justice for indigenous people, has become difficult. And we got to the point that we start having so-called accountability mechanism or dispute settlement mechanisms, which are primarily corporation-led. They are not governed by governments. And experience on the ground in countries like Nigeria, for instance, which have been devastated by, as you know, oil and gas extraction in the last decades in the Niger Delta. Basically, you got to the point that these are also opportunity for corporations to play a divide and rule among communities, among different tribes, and this even exacerbate conflict. So my point is that here the issue is not to basically recognize further rights of indigenous people. The problem is really to walk the talk. To conclude my kickoff is that actually what is very interesting, it is primarily the indigenous people, because of their organizing, in most of cases, even more than local communities, generally speaking. This is our experience again on the ground, primarily in Africa, that are, got to the point in calling to keep coal, oil and gas in the ground. So it is them who basically, if you like, twist the whole paradigm in basically questioning, what could be the mechanisms in order to allow different development paths by keeping fossil fuels in the ground. And here we come to a wider set of questions which are not really addressed, in particular in the Global North or on climate negotiation, which deals with climate justice. There is a question about cleaning up costs and which corporations or northern countries do not want to pay. There is the issue about how to generate other resources in order for compensating for missed income in terms of.
Thanks, Antonio. We got to the point. Let's walk the talk. I think that I can summarize your intervention with this slogan, walk the talk. Thanks a lot, Antonio, and I reiterate my congratulations for all your work as Recommon. It's quite important in Italy to raise the voice and to keep things on moving about these important issues. So I would ask to our special guest. We are talking about the rights of nature. We are having this special focus on indigenous people. So I would ask to both our special guests, so from the global north and the global south, Pedro, how should the global north take its inspiration from the indigenous people for a radical transformation of its development model? So could you please, Pedro and Antonio, from two geographical perspectives, I would say, that is not geographical actually, global north and global south, if you give us some suggestions about how the global north can be inspired from the indigenous people for a radical transformation of the development model.
Gracias, Eugenio. Bueno, yo quisiera digamos, reconectar un poco con lo que decía Antonio respecto a, digamos, cómo se están acabando los recursos de alguna manera y cómo se siguen sacando los recursos de territorios indígenas. Yo creo que, digamos, aquí lo que decíamos antes, ¿no? Hay esta división internacional del trabajo en donde no es algo errático decidir dónde se explotan los recursos, ¿no? Creo que es súper importante tener claro que existe una política estructural, racista, colonial, que justamente despoja a los territorios de los pueblos indígenas, a los territorios del sur, y no sucede lo mismo en la ciudad de New York, no sucede lo mismo en las grandes ciudades o potencias mundiales, ¿no? Existe una división internacional del trabajo que claramente apunta dónde hay que explotar, dónde hay que despojar, dónde hay que saquear. Yo creo que ya más pasando, digamos, a lo que tú preguntabas, creo que es sumamente importante reconocer todo el trabajo del movimiento indígena campesino en el Ecuador, ¿no? Que ha tenido justamente, bueno, en las últimas semanas un protagonismo sumamente importante en cuanto a estos temas tan importantes como la moratoria al extractivismo, ¿no? Poniendo a todos en contexto, en el Ecuador, como decía antes, tenemos un gobierno neoliberal fascistoide, ¿no? Que ha tenido una serie de políticas antipopulares que han precarizado aún más o han empeorado las condiciones de vida de todas las personas en el Ecuador, y esto se ha concentrado también en cuanto al extractivismo, ¿no? O sea, el gobierno de Lazo ha salido a decir públicamente que hay que, como se está acabando el petróleo en el mundo y como el petróleo está cambiando, digamos que el mundo está cambiando hacia nuevas tecnologías para dejar de usar petróleo, lo que el gobierno propone es sacar hasta la última gota de petróleo lo más rápido posible, ¿no? Se ha planteado duplicar la extracción de petróleo en los próximos años, y lo mismo está sucediendo con la minería, ¿no? Por esta razón, el movimiento indígena, que es justamente quien sufre principalmente, directamente, ese extractivismo en sus territorios, ¿no? Aquí en el Ecuador tenemos una larga experiencia de extractivismos con el caso de Texaco Chevron, ¿no? En donde vino Texaco, explotó la Amazonía Norte usando tecnología que en Estados Unidos, en su mismo país de origen, ya estaba prohibida, y sin embargo aquí lo que hacía es, por ejemplo, hacer una serie de piscinas de aguas tóxicas y botarlas a los ríos, y por eso es que estas zonas tienen un alto grado, digamos, de personas que tienen cáncer, que tienen abortos espontáneos, en fin, una serie de enfermedades a la piel, porque hasta el día de hoy, a pesar de que hay una sentencia que justamente reconoce todas estas vulneraciones por parte de Texaco, no se ha limpiado, no ha habido una reparación ambiental, y siguen estas personas sufriendo y muriendo por la contaminación de Texaco. Entonces, como decía, existe un gran precedente en el Ecuador en ese sentido de contaminación y de conocer lo que significa el extractivismo a flor de piel, ¿no es cierto? Y ese extractivismo y esa experiencia, más bien dicho, nos ha llevado a que el movimiento indígena el 13 de junio convoque a un paro nacional. Este paro nacional duró 18 días para el movimiento indígena, incluso las mujeres y disidencias se organizaron y durante todo el paro nacional, incluso hicieron un día más de paro nacional, pero este paro tenía una serie de puntos muy importantes, uno de ellos justamente sobre el tema que hoy discutimos, ¿no? Y es el tema de la moratoria petrolera y minera en territorios indígenas, en territorios, en áreas protegidas, en lugares de protección hídrica. Eso ha sido como uno de los puntos más importantes, y el más conocido, por otro lado, ha sido el tema de los subsidios, ¿no? Que parece contradictorio y que a veces desde el norte global se puede ver como algo que no tiene mucho sentido, ¿no? Que los ecologistas, por ejemplo, apoyemos esta lucha del movimiento indígena, y sin embargo, creo que es justamente desde un desconocimiento o desde una mirada colonial que no podemos entender la situación que viven estos pueblos indígenas y que justamente los subsidios pueden de alguna manera mejorar su condición de vida al ser un mecanismo de beneficio que llega justamente a las clases más populares, como por ejemplo las más marginadas, las que viven más lejos, ¿no? Poniendo así como en concreto un caso, podemos ver cómo desde Omacahueno, que es en el río Shiripuno, en la zona intangible, salir hasta el subcentro de salud más cercano, hacia el hospital más cercano, toma alrededor de 2 días, dependiendo de cómo esté el río, ¿no? Cuando el río está en buenas condiciones, toma 2 días y ese trayecto cuesta en gasolina $100. Costaba en gasolina $100. Ahora con este proyecto de las élites de quitar estos subsidios supuestamente por temas ecológicos, pero a la final lo que están haciendo es privatizando todo y en concreto es una política neoliberal de achicar el Estado, ¿no es cierto? Pero la situación de estas poblaciones que viven totalmente marginadas, que no se cumplen los más derechos básicos, lo que sucedió en la práctica es que ese trayecto que antes les costaba para poder llegar a un hospital $100 de gasolina durante 2 días, solamente en gasolina, ahora les cuesta $160, ¿no? Entonces, se sube como una mitad más de lo que les costaba justamente por quitar estos subsidios. Entonces, yo creo que esa es una lección súper importante que nos da el movimiento indígena al mundo, en el sentido de que no puede haber un ambientalismo, una conservación, una protección de la naturaleza sin justicia social, ¿no? La política, una política ecologista es solamente si esa política es para todas las personas pensando justamente en una inequidad social como la que vivimos, y eso es bien difícil de lograrla en un mundo capitalista, ¿no? Entonces creo que estos elementos tan importantes nos ha dado el movimiento indígena. Este solamente es un ejemplo del paro nacional, pero también, como decía, hay otros ejemplos en la misma constitución, ¿no? Que gracias al movimiento indígena se reconoce el Ecuador como un país plurinacional, como se reconocen los derechos de la naturaleza, ¿no? Y esto también está dando ya sus resultados, como es el caso de los cedros, ¿no? Que se reconocen los derechos de la naturaleza, no como algo específico del río o el bosque, sino como ese ecosistema que incluso ahora ya llega a reconocer los derechos de los animales.
Muchas gracias. Many thanks, Pedro. Again, the issue of social equality or inequality should be be faced as like one of the main important elements. So I would ask basically the same issue to Antonio. So how should the global North take its inspiration from the indigenous people for a radical transformation of its development of model development?
Thanks. I think there are probably 3 main lessons I think we can learn from the global North. The first is that the indigenous people societies, I would say, are primarily centered and based on collective rights. And I think we need to be honest that, you know, we always have this conversation, you know, in our relatively rich societies about despite inequality. You know, if you ask an ordinary person to say how we get out in 10 years out of fossil fuels, no, and it seems an impossible task, but primarily most of the answers are around we subsidize individualism. One, we try to incentivize something else, but again, everything is very much centered on individual rights. And I think, to be fair, we cannot have a just transition without also start thinking through what it means collective rights in our society. So how we share basically the actual cost and burden of the transition in an equal manner. And again, this requires rethinking many things in terms of approaching, including juridically, some of these issues. A second lesson is that the indigenous concept of time and life is primarily a circular one. There are, of course, different indigenous peoples with different cosmogony, if you like, but generally speaking, their view is that it's something, you know, the world developed and through a time which is circular. Now, this basically doesn't separate in our in different approach as we do in particularly in the Western, you know, society or illuministic society, where the time development is linear. This concept about the legacy of the past and the future and the progress and the change. If you are in a circular approach, fixing the legacy of the past is absolutely needed, because the past gets back to the future and gets back to today's present. And so, again, we always have this issue about who's going to pay the cleanup, you know, who is responsible and so on. It's completely dealt in approach, something we honestly have been very lazy or forgot to do in most of our pretty structured society. And we need to always keep in mind these dimensions. And the third point is what we recently discovered, including in the Italian Constitution, the so-called intergenerational rights. Now, we rediscovered this, you know, particularly, you know, young activists on climate, getting mobilized. I think Indigenous people always had this concept in their culture about intergenerational rights, for all the reasons I explained above. So if you take these three conceptual pillars and you use them, for instance, in economic planning or in local planning, things will completely change. And again, you know, this would trigger a complete different view about how we see subsidies, for instance, in the economy. Would generate a different approach in terms about who in the planning, in our view, has to lose and has to win in terms of the just transition and the evolution of the industrial system and so on. So this is to say that there's a lot to learn. There's still a huge cultural gap if you think about the long trajectory of Indigenous people. And I have the feeling that in most of our society, we try to resist transition. It won't be an easy thing to do. and in a way, we need to keep this in mind. And otherwise, again, you know, the just transition will generate new conflicts, new classes, but it is not exactly the transformation of society we need to generate potentially more inequality. So I would say these are three key lessons, you know, we can learn, generally speaking, from the culture and society of Indigenous people.
Thanks, Antonio. Very interesting, these three key elements to understand, to be inspired by the indigenous way to think about the cosmos, I would say. I would add that perhaps I'm still working in indigenous territories in Ecuador and Bolivia. And sometimes when I get back to Italy, I discover also from my colleagues a kind of exotic approach to the indigenous people, the good guys, or something that is so far away with a distance. But as you said, the key elements are around the quality rights. The indigenous people, they don't have the property concept on one side. The concept of the time, if we have, I mean, climate change and climate justice, they have to be approached in this way, because if you take a linear time of things happening, you don't care about climate change because it's not coming back to you. You're not thinking about the third element, that are the intergenerational approach to the rights. That means also taking care of our son, the next generation that is coming, and to giving to them a better world, not a worse world. So I think that you correctly summarize these three lessons that we have to learn from the indigenous vision of the world, that perhaps is like clashing with the neoliberal way to conceive and to design the models of development. So thanks, Antonio, for your interesting contribution. Thanks also, Pedro, for giving like a picture and a perspective, also possible pathways to be worked from Ecuador.